Imagine pulling up to your family's mountain land, the same place your grandfather worked his whole life to preserve, only to find a massive luxury cabin standing right on top of his memorial stone. Not built by you, not built with permission, but by strangers who claimed it was theirs. When I tore it down, the HOA didn't apologize. They sued me for $750,000. What followed wasn't just fraud. It was organized manipulation, fake experts, and a fight that nearly destroyed us. It was a crisp September morning when I finally took my ATV up to check the land. I'd been putting it off for weeks, buried under work. My grandfather Daniel Palmer had carved every fence post here by hand back in the 1950s, and his memorial stone still stood at the edge of the small family cemetery. That stone was sacred to us. But when I rounded the bend, instead of seeing it, I froze. A 2-story luxury cabin stood where the stone should be. Polished logs, a wraparound deck, copper gutters gleaming in the sun. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. This wasn't a shed, or a misplaced hunting cabin. This was a $200,000 lodge, sitting on my land. My hands shook as I snapped photo after photo, saving GPS coordinates, timestamps. This wasn't a boundary mistake. Someone had bulldozed access roads, run electrical wiring, even built a fireplace, all without my consent. And then I heard the sound that made my stomach clench. An expensive SUV pulling up behind me. Out stepped a woman in heels, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Palmer," she said confidently, "we need to talk." The woman introduced herself as Claire Jenkins, president of the Elkridge Heritage Council. She carried herself like a politician who already knew the outcome. Without hesitation, she pulled out a folder thick with papers and handed it to me. "These documents," she explained coolly, "show that your grandfather granted us expansion rights back in 1987. I scanned the pages. They looked official, letterhead, notary stamps, even witness signatures. And there it was, my grandfather's name, neatly signed at the bottom. The problem? My grandfather never signed anything without telling me. He treated the land like his own blood. The date alone was suspicious. September 1987, just 2 years before he died. At that point, his hands were riddled with arthritis. His real signature had grown shaky. This one was smooth, confident, almost too perfect. That night, my wife Rebecca, a former legal assistant with a sharp eye, compared the easement signature to my grandfather's actual will. The difference was glaring. Someone had forged his name using handwriting samples from when he was young and healthy. But how did they get those samples? They weren't in public files. They were from private family papers that should have been impossible to access. A week later, Claire invited me back to the property. She promised to prove why the cabin belonged there. I reluctantly agreed, bringing my best friend Jake along as backup. When we arrived, Claire wasn't alone. A man in khaki field clothes with a clipboard and expensive surveying gear greeted us. Dr. Michael Stevens, he said, archaeologist specializing in Native American sites. He launched into a lecture about how the cabin had been strategically placed to protect artifacts. He pointed out stone fire circles, ancient soil indentations, and then held up arrowheads and pottery fragments he claimed to have uncovered that morning. It looked convincing, until Jake leaned close and whispered, "Those arrowheads? Machine-made replicas. You can buy them at any Denver tourist shop." My stomach dropped. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The fire circles were freshly placed rocks with mortar residue. The pottery was broken too cleanly, like it came straight out of a craft shop. When I challenged Stevens, he drowned me in jargon about ceremonial habitation patterns. But the truth was obvious. The archaeology was staged. Claire didn't flinch. She just smiled and said, "If history doesn't convince you, maybe the environment will." Not long after, another SUV arrived at the demolition site. A woman in a crisp field suit stepped out, flashing a badge. "Dr. Walsh, State Environmental Office," she introduced herself. "I'm here to evaluate risks before demolition." Her words dripped authority: unstable slopes, soil stabilization, landslide potential. She waved around technical equipment, scribbling notes like a scientist on a mission. But Jake, who'd worked construction in these mountains for 15 years, noticed something strange. "Why's she using a soil pH meter to measure landslide risk?" he whispered. "Wrong tool, wrong science." Deputy Morgan, who'd been supervising, decided to check. He called the state office directly. After 10 tense minutes on the phone, he turned to us. "They have no record of a Dr. Walsh. And this van? Government plates are fake." Claire didn't panic. She pivoted instantly, claiming, even if credentials are unclear, environmental concerns must be taken seriously. She called county officials on the spot, stalling demolition for weeks. That's when Jake leaned close and muttered the words that chilled me. "Greg, this isn't HOA politics anymore. This is organized crime." And deep down, I knew he was right. The turning point came from an unlikely source, Claire's husband, Mark. One night, he called me secretly, his voice trembling. "Greg, you need to see what I found." On a hidden folder in her computer, Mark discovered a network of fake social media accounts. Dozens of profiles, complete with photos, backstories, and years of fake posts. These accounts pretended to be neighbors and activists, all praising Claire's heritage preservation work while smearing me as irresponsible. Worse, she had detailed psychological profiles on my family, my wife's work hours, my expenses, even notes about my marriage. She called it the Palmer Vulnerability Assessment. It was chilling, like being stalked by a government agency. Mark also uncovered recordings of her video calls with operatives in other states. They shared strategies, best practices, even target families. Claire wasn't freelancing. She was part of a national network that systematically stole inherited land. But the most disturbing file? A timeline predicting how long my savings would last in court. She calculated when I'd break and planned to swoop in with a settlement offer at my lowest point. That's when I realized we weren't just fighting for land. We were fighting for survival. When the lawsuit finally reached court, Claire strutted in with a team of lawyers, painting me as a hot-headed man who'd destroyed community heritage. Her fake experts submitted glossy reports. Her witnesses swore the cabin had historic significance. Then Mark stepped forward. His hands shook as he presented a USB drive, her secret files. Psychological profiles, fake social campaigns, recordings of her planning attacks on families. The courtroom gasped. But the true shock came when an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stood and revealed herself as Special Agent Patricia Patterson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. She'd been undercover for 18 months, tracking a multi-state inheritance fraud network. Claire's Heritage Council was just one arm. The FBI had linked it to over 90 families across 6 states, with millions in stolen property. And then Patterson dropped the bomb. Several victims hadn't just lost land. They'd lost their lives, sudden medical failures, suspicious accidents, all traced back to intimidation campaigns. Claire's mask cracked for the first time. But when pressed, she smirked and whispered, "Agent Patterson, you have no idea how deep this goes." The room fell silent. For the first time, I wondered if this fight reached far beyond Claire herself. In the end, Claire's arrogance destroyed her. She documented everything: signatures, fake companies, manipulation strategies. What she thought were trophies became the prosecution's most damning evidence. Convicted of fraud, racketeering, and elder abuse, she faced decades in prison. Federal agents dismantled her network, seized her assets, and created a restitution fund for victims. Families began reclaiming their stolen land. For me, the victory was personal. I rebuilt my grandfather's memorial garden with native plants and carved a second stone, engraved with the names of families Claire had targeted. At the dedication, Jake raised a beer to stubborn people who refused to let criminals rewrite history. But the story wasn't over. Months later, Agent Patterson returned with a classified file. My grandfather, she revealed, hadn't just been a farmer. He'd worked as a government surveyor, mapping wilderness boundaries in the 1960s, protecting land developers desperately wanted. She looked me in the eye. "Greg, have you ever been told exactly how your grandfather died?" My blood ran cold. The fight for our land was won, but a darker mystery had just begun.